Do you really think some old black lullaby can do what 20 specialists could not? Alexander Whitmore said, and the grand ballroom went so quiet that even the crystal glasses seemed to stop trembling. The words floated above the polished marble floor, colder than the December rain tapping against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. 200 guests in black suits and evening gowns stood beneath chandeliers bright enough to make every diamond flash. Yet all eyes had turned toward the woman kneeling beside the grand piano. Grace Walker, the temporary maid in a plain navy uniform, kept one hand resting on her own knee and the other open on the floor, palm up, not touching the boy in front of her, not forcing him, not reaching too fast. 8-year-old Noah Whitmore sat curled beneath the shadow of the piano bench, his small shoulders tight, his breath coming in broken little pulls. The charity gala had been planned for months, a $1 million evening for Alexander's foundation, a perfect display of wealth, medicine, and polished compassion. But perfection had cracked the moment a photographer's flash burst too close to Noah's face, and the applause rolled through the room like thunder. The boy had slipped away from his father's side, covered his ears, and folded into himself while adults stared with the helpless discomfort of people who could donate money to suffering but did not know how to sit beside it. Dr. Elaine Porter had tried his name. Mrs. Helen Brooks, the housekeeper, had dimmed one lamp. Alexander had snapped for quiet, then for space, then for someone to fix this, as if his son were another failing machine in one of his companies. Grace had been carrying a tray of water glasses near the service wall when she heard the sound behind Noah's breathing, the thin, frightened hum he made deep in his throat. It was not defiance. It was not drama. It was a child drowning in noise. She set the tray down without asking permission and crossed the room slowly, every step soft against the marble. Someone whispered that she was only staff. Someone else murmured that she should not be near him. Grace did not look back. She lowered herself to the floor about 3 feet from Noah, enough distance to feel safe, close enough to let him know he was not alone. Then, in a voice barely louder than warm air, she began to sing an old lullaby her grandmother had carried from Georgia, a song with no piano, no spotlight, no polished ending, only a steady rhythm that rose and fell like a hand over a sleeping heart. Alexander heard the tune and his face hardened first, then twisted into a small laugh that cut sharper than shouting. "This is what we are doing now," he said, looking around at his guests as if asking them to witness the absurdity. "My son has the best doctors in the country, and she thinks a kitchen song will save him." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared and vanished. Grace's cheeks warmed, but her voice did not break. Noah's fingers, still pressed against his ears, loosened by the smallest inch. The ballroom lights hummed. Rain slid down the glass in silver lines. Alexander stepped closer, anger wrapped in embarrassment, ready to order Grace out before the night became a story rich people would repeat in private. But before he could speak again, Noah lifted his head toward the song, and for the first time all evening, the fear in his eyes began to recognize something softer than noise. Grace Walker had learned long ago that some people only noticed a black woman when they needed something cleaned, carried, or blamed. That was why she had trained herself to move through big houses like a soft shadow, quiet shoes, lowered eyes, hands always busy, voice folded away unless someone asked for it. The Whitmore estate was the largest place she had ever worked, 60 acres outside Greenwich, with a driveway that curved past frozen fountains and maple trees wrapped in white lights for the gala. Inside, every hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil, fresh flowers, and money old enough to feel like weather. Grace had arrived 3 weeks earlier through a staffing agency, listed as temporary domestic support for private events, though the woman at the agency had warned her to keep her head down because Alexander Whitmore dismissed people for smaller things than a misplaced glass. Grace had nodded, signed the papers, and taken the train anyway. Her mother's prescriptions cost more each month than Grace's rent in Bridgeport, and Pride did not pay pharmacy bills. Before Connecticut, before service elevators and marble floors, there had been a narrow porch in Macon, Georgia, where summer heat sat heavy on the skin and cicadas sang so loudly that the evenings felt alive. Grace had been raised by her grandmother, Lottie Mae Walker, a church pianist with bent fingers and a voice that could make a crying baby forget why it had started. Lottie Mae never called the old songs poor. She called them maps. She said some songs were built by people who had nothing but breath left and still found a way to hand safety to a child. Grace had not understood that as a girl. She understood it later, when her little brother Marcus would hide beneath the kitchen table, overwhelmed by the blender, the television, the wrong kind of light, the whole world pressing too hard against his small body. Doctors used long words. Neighbors used crueler ones. Lottie May simply sat on the floor, a few feet away, and sang until Marcus found his way back to them one breath at a time. Grace learned the rules without anyone writing them down. Do not grab. Do not crowd. Lower the light. Soften the room. Let silence have space. Let the child come to you if the child can. Years later, after Marcus grew into a gentle man who fixed radios and remembered every birthday, Grace carried those lessons into every job, even when no one believed a maid could know anything worth knowing. She had seen Noah Whitmore only in passing before the gala, a thin boy with careful steps and eyes that seemed to listen harder than other children's ears did. He moved through the mansion like someone walking across ice, always braced for a crack. Staff were told not to speak to him unless spoken to first, not to enter the West Music Room, not to question the therapists, not to disturb Mr. Whitmore's schedule. Grace obeyed every rule until the night the rules failed him. Now, kneeling beneath the chandelier light with Alexander's laughter still hanging in the air, she kept singing because Noah's fingers had loosened, because his breathing had slowed, because, beneath the shame rising hot in her chest, she could feel the smallest truth opening in the room. The boy was hearing her. Not the uniform, not the color of her skin, not the place others had assigned her. Her. Alexander Whitmore had spent most of his adult life believing that every problem had a price, a plan, and a person who could be hired to solve it. In his world, failure was something managed in conference rooms, softened by legal language, buried under polished statements, and corrected before shareholders had time to panic. He had built Whitmore Biosystems from a small medical software company into a national empire with offices in Boston, Chicago, San Diego, and London, and every magazine profile told the same story. Disciplined, brilliant, impossible to intimidate. What the profiles never mentioned was the silence in his house after Vivian died. They never described the way Alexander used to stand outside Noah's bedroom at 2 in the morning, one hand on the doorknob, listening to his son awake but unreachable on the other side. They never saw him remove every family photograph from the hallway because Noah would stare at his mother's face until his breathing changed. They never heard the specialists explain, gently and carefully, that grief could deepen isolation, that language could disappear under pressure, that progress might not look the way a father wanted it to look. Alexander hated words like might, maybe, patience, process. He wanted charts. He wanted timelines. He wanted results he could hold in his hand. So he built a controlled world around Noah, believing control was the closest thing left to love. The West Wing became a quiet zone with soundproof panels and custom lighting. A private occupational therapist came 4 mornings a week. A speech pathologist came every Tuesday and Thursday. A behavioral consultant flew in once a month from California. There were weighted blankets ordered from 3 different companies, noise-reducing headphones in every room, meal plans, sleep reports, laminated schedules, emergency protocols, and a binder so thick that staff joked about it only when Alexander was far away. Yet none of it brought back the voice that had once called him dad from the top of the stairs. Noah had not sung since Vivian's last summer, when she sat at the piano with a scarf tied around her hair and a tired smile on her face, tapping out simple notes while Noah leaned against her side. Alexander remembered the scene, but not the song. He had been on a call that evening, pacing near the windows, discussing a hospital acquisition worth $400 million while his wife tried to leave their son something softer than money. That memory returned now with cruel clarity as Grace's voice floated under the piano, low and steady, carrying a melody he could not name but somehow felt in the walls of the house. It irritated him first because it did what experts had not done. Then it frightened him because Noah responded. Alexander looked at Grace and saw the uniform, the dark skin, the position he had assigned her, and all the old reflexes of wealth rose inside him like locked doors. She had no credentials on file, no permission, no degree hanging in the therapy suite, no right, as far as he could understand in that moment, to step into the sacred ruin of his family and touch something he could not. The guests watched him watching her, and his embarrassment sharpened into command. He did not think of himself as cruel. Men like Alexander rarely did. They called it standards. They called it order. They called it protecting their family. But beneath the chandelier, with his son breathing more slowly because of a woman he had nearly dismissed as invisible, Alexander felt the first crack in the story he had told himself. And instead of letting the crack open, he tried to seal it with pride. Grace heard Alexander step closer, but she did not stop singing. The choice was small enough for the room to miss and large enough to cost her the job. She knew the shape of a wealthy man's anger before it arrived fully dressed in words. She had seen it in hotel kitchens, private dining rooms, country club foyers, places where a woman like her could be spoken over, corrected, dismissed, and expected to smile because the paycheck depended on silence. But Noah was watching her now. Not steadily, not the way adults demanded, but through quick little glances that touched her face and darted away, like a bird testing whether a window was open or closed. His hands had moved from his ears to the edge of the piano bench. His breathing no longer scraped through the room. Grace lowered the song by half a note, softer, warmer, letting the rhythm slow until it matched the rise and fall of his shoulders. "Miss Walker," Alexander said, and the sound of her name in his mouth felt less like respect than a warning. "Stand up." Grace did not look at him. She looked at the boy. "Give him a minute, sir," she said quietly. The words startled the room more than if she had shouted. A maid had not argued. She had not accused. She had simply placed the need of a frightened child above the command of the richest man in the house. Alexander's jaw tightened. Dr. Elaine Porter shifted near the dessert table, her tablet held against her chest, uncertain whether to intervene or protect her own position. Mrs. Brooks stood near the service doors, one hand pressed to her apron, her eyes damp but still. Grace could feel every stare settling on her back, the polished judgment of guests who had paid $10,000 a plate to support vulnerable children but seemed offended by the sight of one being comforted without permission. Noah made a small sound, not a word, just a thin note that trembled at the edge of the melody. Grace caught it the way her grandmother used to catch fragile things, without grabbing. She repeated that note inside the lullaby, folded it into the song, made room for it as if it had always belonged there. Noah's fingers tapped once against the bench. Then again, the chandelier above them flickered faintly as thunder moved somewhere beyond the windows. Alexander turned toward the string quartet at the far end of the ballroom and snapped his fingers for them to stop. The sudden silence should have helped, but it fell too hard. Noah stiffened. His shoulders climbed. The fear returned to his face. Grace saw it before anyone else did. "Not silence," she said, still calm. "Gentle sound." Alexander stared at her as if she had crossed a line he had never imagined needing to draw. "You are giving instructions in my house now?" he asked. Grace swallowed the sting in her throat. "No, sir. I am telling you what your son is showing us." A few guests looked down. Someone near the fireplace exhaled. Noah's eyes squeezed shut again, and Grace made the only decision her conscience allowed. She reached toward the floor lamp beside the piano and turned the dimmer until the bright gold around them softened to amber. Then she slid the heavy velvet curtain a few inches across the nearest window, blocking the flashing cameras from the patio outside. Every movement was slow. Every movement asked Noah permission without words. The room changed. The marble stopped shining so harshly. The shadows grew kinder. Grace began the lullaby again from the middle, the part Lottie May used to sing when Marcus was almost back, but not ready to be touched. Noah's fingers loosened. His head tilted. Alexander watched, caught between fury and disbelief, while the woman he had tried to reduce to a uniform gently rearranged his perfect ballroom into a place where his son could breathe. For one suspended moment, it seemed as if the whole room might surrender to what was happening in front of them. Noah's breathing had softened. His fingers rested on the piano bench instead of gripping it. The old melody moved through the ballroom like warm thread through cold cloth, stitching together a silence that no specialist, no schedule, no expensive device had been able to make. Grace saw Noah's eyes follow her mouth, not with fear now, but with concentration. He was not lost. He was listening from a place most adults were too impatient to reach. Then Alexander stepped between them and the softened light, his shadow cutting across the marble floor. "Enough," he said. The word dropped heavily, and Noah flinched at the edge of it. Grace stopped singing at once, not because Alexander had won, but because the sharpness in his voice had changed the air around the child. She lifted both hands slowly, palms open, showing Noah that nothing sudden was coming. Alexander turned to the guests with a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, polished and cold. "Please return to the reception. Dr. Porter will handle my son from here." No one moved at first. The lie sat too plainly in the room. Dr. Porter had not been able to get within 6 feet of Noah all evening. Grace had. Mrs. Brooks lowered her eyes, and a silver-haired donor near the fireplace looked away as if shame had touched his sleeve. Alexander's face hardened further. "Miss Walker," he said, without looking at her, "you are relieved of your duties." The words were quiet, but they traveled farther than a shout. Grace felt them land in her chest, right where fear and rent and hospital bills already lived. She thought of her mother's medicine lined up beside the kitchen sink in Bridgeport. She thought of the staffing agency warning her not to make trouble. She thought of every door that had closed the moment someone saw her skin before they heard her voice. Still, she stood slowly, smoothing the front of her navy uniform with hands that did not tremble. "Yes, sir," she said. Noah made a small sound under the piano, a broken little hum reaching after the place where the song had been. Grace looked down at him, and her eyes softened. She wanted to tell him she was not leaving because he had done anything wrong. She wanted to promise that the world would learn to be gentler. But the room was full of adults, and somehow the child was the only one who would have understood. Alexander nodded toward the head of security, a broad man in a black suit who looked uncomfortable the moment he was given the order. "Please walk her to the staff entrance." Grace picked up the water tray she had set down earlier, because even in humiliation, habit told her not to leave glass on marble. That small act seemed to embarrass people more than tears would have. As she passed Alexander, he spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You had no right to use my son to make yourself important." Grace stopped. The chandelier light caught the moisture in her eyes, but her back stayed straight. "He was not disobeying you, sir," she said. "He was drowning." Alexander's expression flickered, but pride sealed it shut. Grace turned and walked toward the service hallway, each step measured, the soles of her shoes nearly silent against the floor. Behind her, Noah's hum faded into the hush of the ballroom. The old lullaby was gone, yet somehow it remained, trembling in the walls, waiting for the one person in that house brave enough to hear what it had uncovered. The service hallway swallowed Grace in a different kind of silence, not the polished silence of marble and chandeliers, but the narrow, humming quiet of back doors, laundry carts, and fluorescent lights that never flattered anyone. The security guard walked beside her without touching her, his eyes fixed forward as if the order embarrassed him. He was young, maybe 25, with a wedding band that still looked new on his hand. At the staff entrance, he stopped and cleared his throat. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said softly. Grace gave him the smallest nod because kindness, even awkward kindness, deserved to be received. "You were doing your job," she replied. The December air struck her face the moment the door opened, sharp and wet, carrying the smell of rain, pine trees, and cold stone. Beyond the service driveway, the estate lights blurred through the drizzle like candles seen through tears. Grace stepped under the small metal awning and held the empty tray against her stomach, suddenly aware that she had carried it all the way out like proof she still belonged to the work even after the house had rejected her. Her breath rose in pale clouds. Her phone was in her coat pocket, buzzing twice with missed calls from her mother's nurse, but she did not reach for it yet. She needed one quiet minute before the world asked her to be strong again. Inside the ballroom, Alexander tried to continue the evening, but the room would not obey him. The quartet resumed with a soft classical piece, yet every note sounded too careful. Guests spoke in lowered voices, their smiles now thin and uncertain. Dr. Porter knelt several feet from Noah and offered him the small picture cards from his therapy bag. Noah did not look at them. He stayed beneath the piano, one hand resting on the bench where Grace's song had seemed to gather. Alexander stood near the fireplace with a glass of sparkling water, untouched in his hand, watching his son from across a room full of donors who suddenly felt like strangers. The anger that had carried him moments earlier began to drain, leaving behind something colder and harder to explain. The boy was not calmer now. He was waiting. Alexander could see it in the tilt of Noah's head, In the way his fingers tapped the rhythm Grace had left behind. One tap, pause. Two taps, pause. It was not random. It was memory trying to find a door. Mrs. Brooks approached Alexander carefully. "Sir," she said, "perhaps we should bring Miss Walker back for a moment." Alexander did not answer. Pride still stood between him and the obvious like a locked gate. "She crossed a boundary," he said, but the words sounded weaker once spoken. Mrs. Brooks looked toward Noah, then back at him. "Sometimes a boundary is just a wall we built before we knew who needed a doorway." The sentence landed quietly and stayed there. Outside, Grace finally set the tray on a storage crate and looked up at the second-floor windows. Warm light spilled from the ballroom onto the wet driveway. She could not hear the guests anymore, only the rain ticking against the awning and the distant wind moving through the bare branches. She closed her eyes, and without meaning to, she hummed the last measures of the song once more, not for the house, not for Alexander, not even for herself, but for the child still sitting somewhere inside that enormous, beautiful room, trying to breathe in a world that kept becoming too loud. At that same moment, beneath the piano, Noah's lips parted. No one heard him at first. His voice was thinner than a whisper, fragile as thread, but his fingers kept tapping the rhythm. The room dimmed around Alexander until only his son remained in focus, small and trembling under the dark curve of the piano, carrying a melody everyone else had been too proud to protect. Noah's voice came again, almost too small to survive the room, but it carried farther than thunder because every person there had been waiting for a sound like it without knowing they were waiting. "When the dark gets heavy," he whispered, each word slow, uneven, and shining with effort. "Dr." Porter froze with the picture card still in her hand. Mrs. Brooks covered her mouth. The quartet fell silent one instrument at a time until the last violin note faded into the rain beyond the windows. Alexander did not move. He could not. The glass in his hand trembled, not from fear of embarrassment now, but from the sudden collapse of every certainty he had used to hold himself upright. Noah lifted one finger and tapped the piano bench twice, then touched the floor where Grace had been kneeling. His eyes searched the space beside him, confused by her absence, but the melody had not left him. He drew in a careful breath and continued, softer than before. "Find my hand and lead me home." The words struck Alexander so deeply that the room disappeared. That was the final line. Not just any line, not some old song he could dismiss, not some kitchen tune he could laugh away in front of donors. Vivian had sung those exact words in the hospital room during her last summer, when her strength was fading, but her voice still found Noah in the corners of his fear. Alexander remembered standing near the door with his phone pressed to his ear, telling a board member that he would call back in 5 minutes. He had not called back. He had stood there, watching Vivian stroke the piano keys drawn on Noah's therapy tablet, whispering that final line until their son placed his tiny hand in hers. Alexander had buried that memory because it hurt too much. He had buried the song with it. But Noah had kept it. Not in the way adults keep things, with photographs and passwords and locked drawers, but in the deep, quiet place where children store safety. Grace had not invented a miracle. She had opened a door Alexander had been standing in front of for 2 years. He looked toward the service hallway, then back at his son, and the shame that rose in him was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was clear. He saw Grace kneeling on the marble with her palms open. He heard himself laughing at the sound that had once belonged to his wife. He remembered the way he had called control love, credentials truth, and obedience respect. Noah looked up then, not directly into his father's eyes, but close enough to break something. "Miss Grace," he whispered. No one corrected him. No one breathed. Alexander crossed the floor slowly, lowering himself until one knee touched the marble several feet from the piano. For once, he did not reach. For once, he did not command. He only sat where Grace had sat and let his son decide what the silence meant. "I heard you," Alexander said, his voice rough and unfamiliar. Noah's fingers tapped the rhythm again, waiting for the song to return. Alexander tried to remember the melody, but grief had left holes in it. The man who could buy hospitals, hire experts, and fill a ballroom with millionaires did not know the next note. Outside, under the metal awning, Grace heard the staff door open behind her. Mrs. Brooks stepped into the rain-lit doorway, eyes wet, breath unsteady. "Miss Walker," she said gently, he sang. Grace turned, her coat collar dark with drizzle, her face still carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had been wounded without losing tenderness. For a moment, she did not step forward. She only listened. From inside the house, faint but real, Noah's voice found the final line again, and Alexander Whitmore finally understood that the woman he had sent away had been the only one brave enough to hear what his son had been trying to say. Grace stepped back into the Whitmore estate through the same staff doorway that had just closed behind her, but the house felt different now, as if the rain had washed something from its walls. Mrs. Brooks walked beside her without speaking, one hand hovering near Grace's elbow but never touching, offering respect in the quietest way she knew. The service hallway opened into the ballroom, and every guest turned as Grace entered. No one smiled this time. No one whispered that she was only staff. Their silence had changed shape. It was no longer judgment. It was witness. Across the marble floor, Alexander remained kneeling several feet from the piano, his tuxedo creased at the knee, his face stripped of the hard certainty that had made him seem untouchable an hour earlier. Noah sat beneath the dark curve of the grand piano, his fingers resting on the bench, his lips still moving. Around the last words of the song as if they were delicate and might vanish if he held them too tightly. Grace stopped at the edge of the softened light. She did not rush to the boy. She did not claim the miracle. She simply lowered herself back to the floor, the way she had before, leaving space for Noah to choose. "I am here," she said gently. Noah looked toward her, and the tension in his shoulders eased with a relief so pure that several people in the room had to look away. Alexander turned to Grace, but for once his apology did not come dressed as authority. His voice was low, uneven, and deeply human. "Miss Walker," he said, "I was wrong." Grace held his gaze. She had heard rich men apologize before when embarrassment forced them to. Quick words meant to clean the room rather than heal the wound. This was not clean. This was a man standing in the wreckage of what he had believed about people, about class, about race, about the difference between education and wisdom. "I laughed at something sacred," Alexander continued. "I laughed because I did not understand it, and because I thought your place in this house meant your knowledge had less value than mine." The room stayed still. Even the rain seemed softer against the windows. Grace's expression did not harden, but it did not rescue him either. "You should not apologize to me first," she said. Alexander looked confused for half a second. Then Grace nodded toward the piano. "He heard you." Those 3 words moved through him more powerfully than any accusation could have. Alexander turned back to Noah, lowering both hands to the floor where his son could see them. "Noah," he said carefully, "I am sorry. I made the room louder when you needed it softer. I sent away the person who was helping you because I was proud and afraid. You did nothing wrong." Noah blinked slowly. His fingers tapped once. Grace watched Alexander fight the instinct to fill the silence. For the first time, he waited. Noah reached toward the floor beside him, not quite touching his father, but close enough to offer a beginning. Alexander's breath caught. He did not take the hand. He let it remain there, a choice instead of a demand. Grace began the melody again, barely above a whisper, and this time Alexander bowed his head and listened. Not as a billionaire, not as the owner of the house, as a father learning the language of his son from the woman he had nearly thrown away. When the final line came, Noah sang it with her, small but clear. Alexander closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his face without permission. Grace did not smile triumphantly. She only kept the rhythm steady, because kindness was never about winning. It was about staying gentle when the world expected you to become hard. By morning, the Whitmore estate no longer looked like a place built to impress strangers. The chandeliers were dimmed, the banquet tables had been cleared, and the ballroom held only the soft gray light that came after a night of rain. Outside, the long driveway shone like black glass, and drops of water clung to the bare branches along the lawn. Grace arrived just after 8 o'clock, not in the navy uniform the agency had given her, but in a simple brown coat, her hair tucked neatly beneath a wool scarf, her hands folded around the strap of her purse. She had expected to enter through the side door, sign whatever papers needed signing, collect her final check, and leave with her dignity intact. But Mrs. Brooks was waiting at the front entrance. She opened the great oak door before Grace could knock and stepped aside with a quiet nod. "This way, Miss Walker," she said. Grace paused at the threshold. The front hall stretched before her, wide and bright, the marble floor reflecting the morning like still water. For 3 weeks, she had carried linens, trays, and folded towels through the back corridors of that house. Now she walked through the front, and no one corrected her. In the West Music Room, Alexander sat on the floor beside the piano, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled to the forearms, looking less like a billionaire than a tired father who had finally stopped pretending he knew how to do everything alone. Noah sat a few feet away with a small blue blanket around his shoulders, tracing circles on the rug with one finger. Between them lay a sheet of paper Alexander had filled with uneven lines of handwritten words, some crossed out, some rewritten, as if he had been trying all night to remember a song he had never taken the time to learn. Grace stopped in the doorway, and Noah looked up first. His face did not change dramatically. There was no sudden smile, no perfect movie moment, only the quiet easing of a child who recognized safety returning to the room. "Miss Grace," he said, barely louder than the rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. Alexander closed his eyes for 1 second, accepting the gift of those 2 words without trying to own them. Then he stood, slowly, keeping his movements gentle. "I spoke with the agency," he said. "They will be paid for the contract, but your future here is your choice, not theirs and not mine." He looked toward Noah, then back at her. "If you choose to stay, it will not be as someone invisible. It will be as part of the care team, with proper pay, proper respect, and the right to say no when this house becomes too loud for him." Grace studied him for a long moment. She did not need his money to become worthy. She had been worthy before he knew her name. What she needed to know was whether his apology would survive daylight. Alexander seemed to understand. He lowered his gaze, not in performance, but in humility. "And I will learn," he said. "From you. From him. From the silence I kept trying to control." Grace stepped into the room. She did not answer right away. Instead, she sat on the rug, leaving the same careful space she had left the night before. Noah touched the edge of the blanket, then tapped the rhythm once, twice, pause. Alexander looked at the paper in his hand, cleared his throat, and tried to sing the first line. He missed the melody almost immediately. Noah turned his head and corrected him with a small, clear note. Alexander stopped, listened, and tried again, softer this time. Grace joined only when the room was ready for her voice. Morning light spread across the piano keys, across the rug, across Alexander's bowed head, across Noah's small hand resting near his father's, but not forced into it. The house stayed quiet, not empty quiet, not grieving quiet, but the kind of quiet that grows when people finally stop trying to win and begin to listen. Grace kept the rhythm steady, and when the final line came, Noah sang it first. Alexander followed, imperfect but present. No one applauded. No one needed to. Justice had entered the room without making a sound.